My husband locked me in the wine cellar all night because I found the black ledger hidden behind the altar. When he unlocked the heavy oak door this morning, he smiled with the arrogance of a man who believes he has finally tamed a rebellious animal. I did not cry or beg. I simply walked past him, smoothed my skirt, and went to the kitchen to prepare his morning tea. The color drained from his face when he saw the florist delivery boy standing at the back door, witnessing my torn sleeve and the dark bruise blooming on my cheek before Thomas could slam the door shut. He realized then that my silence was not submission. It was a death sentence, waiting to be executed. You know that feeling when you walk into a house that feels too perfect to be real, like a museum display where nothing is ever touched. That is my life inside the parsonage. The air here always smells of lemon polish and old hymnals, a scent that used to bring me comfort, but now feels like formaldehyde preserving a corpse. I am the curator of this museum, the invisible hand that dusts the mahogany pews and irons the altar cloths until they are seamless white flags of surrender. For 20 years. I have been the preacher's wife, the silent shadow who nods at the sermons and smiles at the congregation, hiding the insults under high collars and long sleeves. I sacrificed my voice so his could boom from the pulpit, believing that my suffering was a holy duty to protect the flock from scandal. But when the cold dampness of the cellar seeped into my bones last night, I realized something that terrified me more than his fists. The woman who loved him enough to endure this hell died in that darkness. And the stranger who walked up the stairs this morning is capable of things the old Sarah could never imagine. The kitchen was bathed in the pale gray light of dawn, a stark contrast to the pitch-black void I had inhabited for the last 8 hours. My hands moved with a mechanical precision that frightened me, measuring the loose leaf tea and slicing the lemons into perfect circles. Every motion sent a sharp jolt of pain radiating from my ribs where he had kicked me, but I welcomed the agony because it kept me focused. The house was quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, counting down the minutes until the mask had to be firmly back in place. I looked down at my hands, the same hands that had once taught Thomas how to hold a pen without shaking, now trembling slightly not from fear, but from the adrenaline of a soldier preparing for battle. The memory of the cellar was still fresh, the smell of mold and vintage wine, the cold stone floor against my cheek, and the sound of the lock clicking shut, sealing my fate. It was in that silence that I stopped praying for him to change and started praying for the strength to end it. Thomas entered the kitchen with the confident stride of a man who owns the world, wearing his silk dressing gown and the benevolent expression he practiced in the mirror every Sunday. He did not ask if I was hurt. He did not apologize for the violence. He simply glanced at the breakfast table to ensure his toast was toasted to the exact shade of golden brown he preferred. He walked up behind me, placing a hand on my shoulder right over the bruise, his fingers digging in slightly as a reminder of his power. He leaned close to my ear, his breath smelling of stale whiskey and peppermint mouthwash, and whispered that we had a long day ahead with the elders. He told me to cover up the mess on my face because we could not have the flock worrying about their shepherd's clumsy wife. I stood frozen, feeling the heat of his body against mine, fighting the urge to shatter the teapot over his head. Instead, I poured his tea without spilling a single drop, watching the steam rise like a ghost between us. He sat at the head of the table and opened his newspaper, completely dismissing my presence now that his needs were met. He assumed that the night in the cellar had done its job, that I was back in my box, a broken doll ready to be displayed when necessary. He did not notice that I had set his place setting with the heavy silver knife pointed directly at his chest, a subtle disruption in the perfect geometry of the table. He did not see the way I looked at the knife, calculating the force required to pierce through the layers of silk and deceit. I turned away to the sink and began to wash the preparation dishes, the hot water scalding my skin, cleansing me of the lingering chill. I watched him through the reflection in the window, a small man casting a large shadow, unaware that the foundation of his temple had already cracked. The phone on the wall began to ring, shattering the silence, and for the first time in years, I did not jump. I let it ring, knowing that today, every call, every knock, every visitor was a player in the tragedy I was about to direct. The phone stopped ringing before I could reach it, leaving the kitchen suspended in a silence that felt heavier than the cast-iron skillet hanging above the stove. In this house, silence is not peace. It is a vacuum waiting to be filled with Thomas's voice or his demands. We live in the parsonage, a sprawling Victorian structure provided by the church council, a place that belongs to God on paper but belongs to the public in practice. Every window feels like an unblinking eye staring in, judging the curvature of my spine as I scrub the floors and the whiteness of the linens I hang on the line. You know that feeling when you walk into a cathedral and automatically lower your voice because the weight of the architecture demands submission. That is what it is like to live here. The walls are lined with portraits of stern men in stiff collars who founded this town. Men who look at me with the same disappointment I see in my husband's eyes. There are crosses in every room, wooden ones, brass ones, embroidered ones, constant reminders that suffering is a virtue and obedience is the highest form of love. I used to think these symbols were here to protect us from evil. Now I know they are just bars on a very ornate cage designed to keep the secrets in and the truth out. Thomas finished his toast and wiped his mouth with the linen napkin, placing it on the table with a deliberate slowness that made my stomach tighten. He did not say thank you. In his mind, my service is not a gift. It is a tithe I owe him for the privilege of being his wife. He stood up and adjusted his collar in the reflection of the china cabinet, smoothing out a microscopic wrinkle on his lapel. He is a man obsessed with surfaces. The exterior must be flawless, shiny, and impenetrable. He looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time that morning. His eyes swept over my messy hair and the way I favored my left side because of the bruised ribs. He sighed, a sound of long-suffering patience that he had perfected for the pulpit. He told me that I looked like a ghost and that I needed to put some color on my cheeks before the elders arrived. He said it as if my pain was an inconvenience to his aesthetic, as if the purple mark on my face was a stain on his reputation rather than a testament to his cruelty. He walked past me, the scent of his expensive cologne mixing with the smell of bacon grease, and patted my shoulder. He told me to be a good girl and make the house shine, because today was important for the ministry. I watched him walk down the hallway toward his study, the heavy oak floorboards barely creaking under his expensive leather shoes. For years, I bought into this performance. I played the role of the dutiful wife who sat in the front pew, nodding at his sermons about compassion and grace while concealing the bruises on my arms with long sleeves. I convinced myself that his temper was just the pressure of his calling, that the man of God was under attack by spiritual forces and I was his anchor. It is a seductive lie, isn't it? The idea that you are the only one who can save a powerful man from himself. I remember the first time he hit me, 10 years ago. It was over a burnt roast. He cried afterward, held me, prayed over me, told me the devil had entered him. I believed him. I forgave him. I paved the road to my own hell with those forgivenesses, one stone at a time. But the house remembers. The floorboards in the living room know the weight of my body falling. The walls of the bedroom have absorbed my stifled sobs until the plaster feels damp with them. This house is not a sanctuary. It is a crime scene that has been scrubbed clean with lemon oil and bleach every single day for a decade. I turned back to the sink and plunged my hands into the soapy water. The heat stung my skin, but I needed to feel something other than the cold numbness that had settled in my chest. I started scrubbing the plate he had eaten off of, the floral pattern disappearing under the foam. It was a wedding gift from the ladies' auxiliary, bone china, delicate and translucent, just like they expected me to be. I scrubbed harder, watching the suds turn gray. Yesterday, before the cellar, before the darkness. I was just like this plate, fragile and serving a purpose I did not choose. I had gone into his study to dust, a task he usually forbade, but the cleaning lady was sick. That was when I knocked over the stack of hymnals on his desk and saw it. The black ledger. It wasn't the church's official accounting book. It was a small, leather-bound notebook tucked inside a hollowed-out Bible. I shouldn't have opened it. A smart woman, a surviving woman, would have put it back and forgotten she ever saw it. But I opened it, and in those pages, written in his meticulous handwriting, was the truth that shattered the stained glass window of my life, entries for consultation fees that matched the withdrawals from the orphans' fund, notes about gifts for a woman named Jessica. The memory of the ledger made my hands shake, and the plate slipped from my soapy fingers. It hit the edge of the cast-iron sink with a sharp crack, splitting perfectly down the middle. I froze, waiting for the inevitable sound of his footsteps rushing back to investigate the noise, waiting for the punishment that usually followed any breakage. But the house remained silent. He was in his study, likely practicing his opening prayer for the meeting, rehearsing the humble tone he would use to ask for more money. I looked at the broken plate, two jagged halves resting in the dirty water. It wasn't a tragedy. It was a liberation. I picked up one of the shards, feeling the sharp edge against my thumb. It was dangerous. It could draw blood. For the first time, I didn't rush to throw the broken pieces away to hide the evidence of my clumsiness. I rinsed the shard carefully and dried it with a towel. The old Sarah would have panicked. The new Sarah, the one born in the cellar, simply saw it as a tool. I placed the sharp ceramic piece in the pocket of my apron, right next to the pantry key. It felt heavy, a solid weight against my hip, grounding me. I moved to the living room, the designated staging area for the upcoming performance. The furniture was arranged in a conversational circle, designed to facilitate agreement and check writing. I began to dust the mantel, where the accolades of his career were displayed. The Pastor of the Year plaque, the framed newspaper clippings of his charity drives, the photo of us on our 10th anniversary, where his hand is gripping my waist so tight his knuckles are white. I looked at that woman in the photo. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. She looked tired, scared, trying so hard to be perfect. I took the cloth and wiped the dust from the frame, but I didn't stop there. I kept wiping until the glass was smeared, until the image was blurry and indistinct. I am not that woman anymore. I am the cleaner, the eraser. Today, I am not just cleaning the house for guests. I am preparing the altar for a sacrifice. But this time, the lamb won't be me. The grandfather clock chimed the quarter hour, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the floor. We had 2 hours before the elders arrived, 2 hours to set the stage, 2 hours to turn this house of God into a courtroom where the judge, jury, and executioner would be the silent woman pouring the tea. The chime of the grandfather clock resonated deep inside the bone china shard tucked into my apron pocket. 2 hours. 2 hours until the veneer of this blessed parsonage cracked wide open and revealed the rot beneath. I continued dusting the mahogany mantelpiece, my hand running over the brass plaque that read, "To Pastor Thomas, our guiding light." I saw Thomas through the reflection in the polished wood, sitting at his desk in the study, head bowed, rehearsing his sermon. He looked like the epitome of piety, a man burdened by grace. But I knew the truth about that posture. It wasn't humility, it was calculation. I knew because I saw that same posture exactly 12 hours ago, right before the storm. You know, people always ask me how I stood by him for so long, how I endured the quiet cruelty and the loud rages. They think it takes strength, but it doesn't. It takes exhaustion. It takes believing the lie that if you just love harder, if you just pray longer, the good man buried inside will claw his way back to the surface. But yesterday was different. Yesterday, I stopped loving the ghost of the man he used to be and saw the monster he truly was. I closed my eyes for a moment, the smell of lemon polish fading, replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of fear and stale wine. I was standing in the small, curtained confessional booth tucked into a quiet corner of the church hall. I had followed him there, knowing he often used the solitude to make private calls about the church finances he handled so poorly. But I didn't find a phone. I found the ledger. It was tucked inside the second volume of the Reverend's private commentary on the Book of Job. A grim irony. I remember my fingers trembling as I read the entry. Not just about the trips to the coast, not just about the $1,000 bracelets for Jessica D., but the withdrawal of $7,000 earmarked for the new children's wing, funds collected during the Christmas drive. Money meant for children without families. That was the moment. The exact second the good wife died. It wasn't the bruises on my arm he'd given me last month. It was the knowledge that he wasn't just abusing me, he was stealing from God, from the helpless. I didn't sneak away. I waited for him. I stood right there in the small wooden box where people confess their darkest sins, clutching that black leather notebook like a weapon. He walked in late, his expression already tight with annoyance. He assumed I was waiting to confess some trivial domestic sin. But when he saw the ledger in my hand, his face went slack, the mask dissolving instantly. The man standing before me was not my husband, not the pastor, but a stranger with eyes full of cold, violent fury. He didn't raise his voice, not at first. He spoke in that low, controlled baritone he used when sermonizing about the consequences of sin. He asked me how dare I desecrate the sacred space of his calling. He didn't deny the embezzlement. He didn't even address the mistress. He made it about me, about my lack of faith, my paranoia, my failure as a supportive wife. He said I was a poison that corrupted everything I touched. He tried to snatch the ledger away, but I held tight. I told him he was a hypocrite, a thief. I told him that the only thing desecrating this space was his rotten soul. That was when the violence reached its peak. It wasn't a drunken rage. It was calculated, focused, and terrifyingly silent. He grabbed the wooden lattice dividing the confessional and slammed my head against it. Once, twice, not hard enough to knock me out, but hard enough to make the church bells ring inside my skull. I slid to the floor, the blood warm and sticky on my cheek. He grabbed my shoulders and shook me until my teeth rattled, demanding to know where I had found the book. He screamed in that low whisper that only a predator can manage, saying he would make me regret ever daring to look beyond the surface of his perfect life. He dragged me out of the booth and across the cold stone floor of the church hall, past the empty pews where his flock would gather in 2 days to worship him. He didn't care that he was desecrating the sanctuary. He only cared about the shame, about the ledger. He didn't take me to the rectory. He dragged me through the rain, across the manicured lawn of the parsonage, and threw me down the stone steps into the wine cellar. He kicked me once, just one sharp, efficient blow to the side that stole my breath, and then he slammed the heavy oak door shut. The darkness was absolute, suffocating. I lay there for a long time, curled on the cold floor, listening to the sound of my own shallow breathing and the drip of condensation. I felt the pain, But the physical pain was secondary. The real hurt was the final, shattering realization that the man I married was gone, that the man who hit me was the real Thomas. The silence in that cellar was the first honest moment I had shared with myself in 20 years. It was the moment I stopped hoping for salvation and started planning retribution. I touched the place on my ribs where the pain still flares, a constant reminder of the price of his perfection. That memory, the pain, is my greatest asset. It is the fuel for the next 2 hours. The air in the living room now felt too clean, too bright. The intense recollection of the violence left me slightly dizzy, my fingers gripping the edge of the mantel for support. The physical pain was a dull, constant pressure beneath my ribs, a small fire that fueled the cold resolve settling in my heart. Thomas was still silent in his study, the sound of his pen scratching against paper the only noise betraying his existence. I knew he was writing about grace, about forgiveness, preparing the words that would later soothe the conscience of the wealthy and maintain his perfect façade. I looked down at the shard of china in my pocket, a mundane object transformed into a tangible symbol of defiance. It was heavy, but not nearly as heavy as the darkness of the cellar. You know, when you are trapped in absolute darkness, your other senses become cruel masters. I could taste the dust, the old wood, and the lingering metallic flavor of my own fear. Hours dissolved into one long, cold minute down there. It wasn't just physical confinement. It was spiritual isolation. I lay on the cold concrete floor, unable to move much because of the pain, and listened. There were no sounds of God, no whispers of comfort or mercy, only the distant drip of water, an incessant tick that sounded like time running out on my life. I used to seek silence for prayer, believing that solitude brought me closer to the divine. But that night, I found that the silence held nothing but Thomas's absence, an empty space where love and protection should have been. It was there, in the dark, that I finally stopped waiting for the miracle and accepted the end. I thought about the silver cross necklace he gave me 20 years ago, when we were poor and honest. I had worn it constantly, a weight on my breast that represented our shared faith, our sacrifice, our dream. In the pitch black of the cellar, I reached up and found the clasp. It was cold. Cheap metal now, not a symbol of devotion but a chain of obligation. I fumbled with it for a long minute, my bruised fingers struggling with the small mechanism. When it finally came loose, the chain slid away from my neck, freeing my throat. I didn't throw it. I didn't smash it. I simply placed the cross on the damp floor, a small, silver monument to a love that had died of neglect and betrayal. That was the moment of transfer, the split second where the resigned wife died and the judge was born. I knew then that I would not leave this house until every single layer of his perfect lie was stripped away. When Thomas finally opened the door this morning, letting a blinding shaft of light into the darkness, I saw my chance. I knew he would check the cellar first thing. He needed to ensure his victim was still breathing, still pliable. When I stood up, aching but composed, I wasn't just walking out of the cellar. I was walking out of the marriage, before I climbed the steps. I reached under the stairs where I had hidden it earlier that day before the confrontation, and grabbed the small black leather notebook, the ledger that held all the proof. I knew he wouldn't search for it immediately, too arrogant to think I had the presence of mind to save it. I brought it up with me, tucked deep into the waistband of my skirt, a cold, hard truth pressed against my skin, the ultimate witness against the good pastor. Now, standing here in the morning light, the scent of lemon oil is everywhere, a frantic attempt to cleanse the house of its sins. I smoothed down my apron, feeling the ledger and the sharp piece of china against my body. Two witnesses to two different kinds of violence. The elders' meeting starts in less than 2 hours. Thomas will come out soon, expecting breakfast, expecting my silence. He will think he has won the first round. He will assume the worst of the ordeal is over. But you know what the darkest quiet moments teach you? They teach you patience. They teach you to wait for the exact, precise moment to make your move. I walked back toward the kitchen, my step measured, not showing the pain in my ribs, ready to serve the meal that would be the beginning of his end. The worst is not over, Thomas. The worst is just beginning. I walked back into the bright kitchen, the black ledger pressed against my skin under the apron. The weight was comforting, substantial. The shard of china in my pocket felt like a key. Not to a lock, but to a door I had just opened. Thomas was still in his study, the low murmur of his voice practicing his perfect humility for the elders' meeting. I knew I had to move quickly. The next stage of my preparation was not for the house or the table, it was for the body, the container that held the evidence. I slipped out of the kitchen and into the small, linen closet bathroom off the back hall. Locking the door behind me, a simple act of separation that felt like a lifetime of freedom. The woman who looked back at me from the cheap, fogged mirror was a stranger. Her eyes were dull, her hair was matted and smelled faintly of mildew from the cellar. A dark, ugly bruise bloomed on her left cheekbone, a purple reminder of the wooden lattice of the confessional booth. I slowly lifted my heavy cotton blouse, revealing the raw, red welts circling my ribs where Thomas had kicked me. The pain was immediate, sharp, and focused. I didn't wince. I observed. I catalogued. The physical damage was extensive, a masterpiece of domestic violence that had been created to be seen only by the executioner. I needed to become invisible again. I needed to turn the crime scene into a canvas of perfection. I found the small emergency kit under the sink. Thomas kept it stocked because appearances were paramount. I didn't bother with pain medication. I needed the sting, the constant reminder of the $7,000 stolen from the orphans. I took the concealer, the thickest paste I owned, and began the meticulous process of painting over the violence. I worked slowly, deliberately, blending the beige into the purple and blue, transforming the evidence of his wrath into a flawless public face. I remembered my mother telling me that a good Southern woman always smiles even when her heart is breaking. I realized then that my lifelong commitment to beauty was never about vanity. It was about survival. It was about building a reliable mask. I finished the work on my cheek, leaning close to the mirror. The bruise was gone. Only the slight puffiness of the swelling remained. The biggest challenge was the collar of the dress. I chose my favorite navy dress, the one with the high, lace-trimmed neck that gave me a severe, pious look. It covered the ligature marks on my throat and the bruises on my shoulders perfectly. But the concealment was not enough. I needed to look serene. I needed to look happy. I stood back from the mirror, taking a deep breath that pulled painfully against my ribs and forced my mouth into the smile Thomas expected. It was a cold smile, empty of warmth, but visually perfect. I pinned a small, white enamel dove to the lace collar, a symbol of peace and the Holy Spirit. He would love the dove. He would see it as my public declaration of submission and forgiveness. He would see a perfectly preserved wife, ready to be shown off. I checked the time. The clock was rushing now. I heard the door to his study open, a sharp, decisive sound. Thomas was coming to inspect the goods. I slipped the black ledger from my waistband and tucked it deep inside the cedar chest in the linen closet, covering it with a stack of church bulletins. It was safe for now. The shard of china remained in my apron pocket. I took one last look in the mirror, not at the face, but at the eyes. They were wide, steady, and filled with a cold, terrifying certainty. The old Sarah, the one who cried and begged for things to be better. She was gone. The woman who looked back was a judge, ready to step onto the stage. I unlocked the door and stepped out into the hallway. Thomas was standing there, waiting, blocking the path back to the kitchen. He looked me over from the top of my meticulously pinned bun to the polished tips of my church shoes. His eyes lingered on the high neckline of the navy dress. He reached out and adjusted the white enamel dove, his fingers brushing the lace. He smiled, a genuine, satisfied predator's smile, and told me that I looked beautiful. He said, "Now that is the faithful wife the elders want to see. Bless your heart. Sarah, you always clean up so well." I met his gaze and returned his empty smile. The danger was not over. It was just entering the house. Thomas took my arm lightly, guiding me back toward the kitchen with the proprietary air of a man showing off a valuable piece of art. His approval was a fleeting warmth, a small reward for my successful performance. The phrase he used, "You always clean up so well," echoed in my mind. He meant the house. He meant my face. He meant the marriage. Everything was just surface deep for him. I nodded meekly and slipped back into the heart of the home, the kitchen, the one space he rarely intruded on once my work had begun. This was my sanctuary, my forge, my laboratory. The counter was laid out with ingredients for the traditional Southern brunch he required for important church functions. Creamy stone-ground grits, biscuits made with perfect buttermilk, and the slow-cooked savory ham that always won over the most skeptical elder. This meticulous work, the rhythmic kneading of the dough, the slow stirring of the pot, felt less like cooking and more like an intense therapy session. I focused entirely on the mechanics of the meal, measuring each cup of flour with a precision that bordered on obsession. The simple perfection of a recipe was a welcome contrast to the chaos of my life. It was control, absolute and total. The soft dough pressed under my fingertips was pliable, cooperative, unlike the granite stubbornness of my husband. You know, there is something unsettling about making a dish too perfect, when every biscuit rises to the same height. When the butter melts with the exact right sheen on the ham, it stops being food and starts being a message. This meal was not meant to nourish. It was meant to disarm, to blind them with familiarity and comfort, so they would not see the sharp edges beneath the surface. I was pouring all my cold rage into the butter and sugar, creating a delicious Trojan horse that would carry the truth right past the gates of their judgment. I checked the small, ceramic timer on the counter, counting down the final minutes. The shard of china in my apron pocket felt like a cold stone, heavy and present. Thomas reappeared in the doorway, now fully dressed in his impeccable dark suit. The picture of pastoral dignity. He hadn't come to help. He had come to check. He walked over to the silver coffee service I had prepared and ran a finger over the lid. He frowned slightly, a barely perceptible twitch of his eyebrow that spoke volumes. He told me that the silver on the handles looked slightly tarnished. He told me to polish it again, immediately, before the Truong Lau Williams arrived. He stressed that Williams noticed details, and that a small lapse in appearance could make us look unprepared. It was a pointless, petty instruction, a final show of dominance before the real audience arrived. I stood there, the thick flour dust covering my hands and my navy dress, and simply said, "Yes, Thomas." He walked away, satisfied that he had successfully exerted his authority one last time. I returned to the counter, ignoring the biscuits cooling on the wire rack, and pulled out the small, velvet-lined box that held the silver polish. My ribs ached with the unnecessary effort, but I complied, running the small cloth over the already gleaming silver. I wasn't just polishing the handles, I was sharpening the edges of the performance, polishing the image of the dutiful wife until it blinded the viewer. The irony was suffocating. He wanted me to make the tools of his facade perfect, and I was happy to oblige. I needed everything to be flawless, including my obedience, so that when the curtain finally dropped, the contrast would be absolute. The small sound of a car crunching on the gravel driveway outside broke the silence. The first elder, the advance guard, had arrived. The clock had run out. My time for silent preparation was over. The feast was ready. The crunch of the gravel in the driveway was a definitive sound. It was the moment the door officially opened to the outside world. I quickly put away the silver polish and wiped the residue from my fingertips. The elder, likely Truong Lao Williams, was now at the front door. Thomas's voice, smooth and deeply welcoming, drifted from the hall, a sound engineered to instantly instill trust. I did not move immediately to assist with the greetings. I needed this last minute of separation, a final anchor to the woman I used to be before the performance began. I turned my attention to the old enamel coffee pot heating slowly on the stove, the deep, rich aroma of the blend filling the kitchen. I reached for my favorite mug, an old, oversized ceramic cup with a chipped rim. It wasn't church china. It was a relic from our first tiny apartment above the dry cleaner, a time when we had nothing but felt wealthy in our belief in each other. There was a faded inscription on the side, etched awkwardly with a sharp tool, S&T, forever. I traced the letters with my thumb, the roughness of the chip, the imperfection of the etching. It stood in stark contrast to the flawless, sterile environment I now maintained. The sight of that chipped mug brought the past flooding back with a devastating clarity. You know, Thomas was not born a monster. He was born terrified. When I met him 20 years ago, he was a young, brilliant divinity student from a dirt-poor background, but he suffered from a debilitating stutter. He could barely string 3 words together without stumbling over himself. His fear was palpable, a trembling vulnerability that made me want to protect him. He was humble then, honest. He didn't have the grand suits or the silver service. He wore clothes I mended and drank coffee from that chipped mug. He used to come to my small studio apartment and weep out of frustration because he felt God had given him a calling, but denied him the voice to fulfill it. His shame was raw, real, and I loved him fiercely for his weakness. I spent months working with him, not as a wife or a girlfriend, but as a quiet coach. I taught him breathing techniques. I taught him how to slow down, how to savor the words before they left his mouth. It was a painstaking process, built on trust and absolute intimacy. I remember the day he spoke an entire chapter of the Bible without stuttering. His face was radiant, pure joy. He looked at me then with an adoration that was absolutely genuine. He told me that I was his miracle, that I had given him his voice, that Thomas, the struggling young man with messy hair and an honest heart, he was the real sacrifice in this marriage. It wasn't my time or my silence. It was his soul, which was devoured by the confidence I helped him find. The pain of that memory was sharper than the cut from the shard in my apron pocket. The man greeting the elder right now, the one with the booming, controlled voice and the impeccable manners, that man was a creation, a monster built on the foundation of my patient love and my endless coaching, the fluency of his speech, the clarity of his tone. Every perfect word he spoke outside in the hall was a bitter betrayal of the silent man who used to hold my hand and beg me to help him. I looked at the chipped mug again, at the crude inscription, and felt a wave of profound pity, not for myself, but for the boy who had died the moment he learned how to talk without stammering. It was a pity so deep it was almost contempt. I heard the footsteps moving away from the front door. Thomas was escorting the elder into the living room to settle them before the formal start of the meeting. I had perhaps 3 minutes before Thomas would call me to bring the coffee. Just 3 minutes to transition from the heartbroken widow of the good Thomas to the polished, vengeful wife of the current pastor. I took a deep breath, the scent of ham and coffee filling my lungs. I placed the chipped mug back on the shelf, out of sight. That past was dead. I had to focus on the future. I reached into my apron pocket, touching the ceramic shard once more for courage. It was time to retrieve the silver coffee service I had just polished and deliver it to the judge. I lifted the silver coffee service, the pot heavy and perfectly polished. The handle was cold beneath my fingers, but my movements were steady. The black leather ledger was still tucked against my skin, a hidden armor beneath the navy dress. I pushed through the swinging kitchen door and entered the formal dining room. The sight that greeted me was a performance already in full swing. Thomas was standing beside the fireplace, chatting with Truong Lao Williams. Williams was a tall, imposing man with a severe face and an air of unshakable righteousness. He was the most powerful elder, the very definition of old money and traditional values in this town. Thomas was using his full repertoire of charm, his head tilted just so, his hands gesturing gracefully to emphasize a point about community service. He looked magnificent, entirely comfortable in the golden light filtering through the tall windows. When he saw me enter, his smile broadened, a manufactured light designed purely for Williams's benefit. He introduced me as "My dear Sarah, the heart of our ministry," and I nodded demurely, the white enamel dove on my collar gleaming like a medal of false purity. I placed the heavy silver tray on the low coffee table with painstaking care, every cup and saucer landing silently. I avoided looking directly at Williams, focusing instead on the task, the ritual, but I could not ignore Thomas. His voice, now rich and resonant, was exactly what I had worked so hard to create. He was talking about integrity, about the absolute necessity of transparency in the church's financial dealings, and his words hit me like physical blows. The irony was suffocating. I filled Williams's cup first, the dark coffee steaming, and in that moment, watching Thomas stand tall and proud, I was plunged back into the past. Not the painful past of his stuttering fear, but the triumphant past of his first great success. You know, every monster has a moment of genesis, an instant when the human shell cracks and the pride takes over. For Thomas, it was the statewide Pastoral Leadership Award. He had given a keynote speech at the annual convention, a sermon about humble service that moved the entire audience to tears. It was masterful, entirely flawless. When he walked off that stage, the flashbulbs popping, the applause deafening, he wasn't just my husband anymore. He was Thomas, the celebrated orator, the genius. I was backstage, holding his simple black suit jacket, my hands sticky with excitement and pride. He turned to me, not with the adoration of the young man I knew, but with a kind of clinical assessment. He saw the pride in my eyes and smiled, but it was a smile of ownership, not partnership. He took the award statue, a heavy bronze figure of a shepherd, and didn't even let me touch it. He told me that my work was done, that the voice was his now. He said that I should focus on maintaining the home while he focused on maintaining the flock. That day, Thomas stopped needing me as his coach, his collaborator, and started seeing me as his prop, his foundation, something necessary but far less valuable than his bronze shepherd. He held that statue high above his head for the cameras, and the sheer, intoxicating power of that moment, the roar of the crowd. It burned the last vestiges of his old humility right out of him. It was the moment he realized he could lie to thousands with the same conviction he used to share the truth with me. Back in the living room, Thomas was wrapping up his monologue on virtue. Williams nodded gravely, clearly impressed. He accepted the cup of coffee I offered him, his fingers brushing against the rim of the saucer. Thomas stepped forward, his hand landing firmly on my back, right above the bruised ribs. It was a possessive gesture, a public claim of ownership, but the pressure made me gasp inwardly, a sharp, agonizing intake of air that only I could feel. He looked down at me, his eyes conveying a subtle threat, a reminder of the cellar. He smiled at Williams and said, "We are blessed to have Sarah. She sacrifices everything for my calling." I met his gaze directly this time, maintaining my perfect, frozen smile. I felt the sharp edge of the china shard in my pocket digging into my palm. He saw the smile. He saw the dove. He saw the beautiful surface. But I was looking past him, past the award, past the pulpit, and straight into the dark, cold heart of the man who had traded his soul for applause. The true tragedy wasn't the theft of the money, it was the theft of the man. I backed away from Thomas and Truong Lao Williams, using the necessary trip back to the kitchen to gather the cooling biscuits. The touch of his hand on my back still stung, a clear reminder that despite the performance, I was still his prisoner. But his touch also provided the final piece of the puzzle, the missing link between the arrogant orator of the present and the stumbling boy of the past. The decay hadn't been sudden. It had been slow, insidious, like termites eating away at the foundation of a seemingly strong house. I closed the kitchen door behind me, letting the soft click seal me in. You know, when someone starts falling, you grab their hand, but when they start enjoying the fall, you realize you are just pulling them down faster. After the great success of the award, the pressure on Thomas became unbearable. He had set the bar too high. His next few sermons were adequate, but they lacked the fire, the genius. The whispers started. The local papers questioned if he was a one-hit wonder. That fear of losing the applause, the fear of returning to the stuttering boy I knew, that is what truly broke him. It was a failure of the ego, not the spirit. He became desperate. He sought escape in the only place he knew he could still be in absolute control: our home. The first serious sign of the slide came 3 years ago, a quiet Sunday morning. Thomas wasn't drunk or high, he was simply terrified. He had gambled away nearly $10,000 of his personal savings, money earmarked for our retirement, in a desperate attempt to feel the rush of victory again. He came home shaking, not from rage, but from profound, naked fear. He confessed to me, not seeking forgiveness from God, but seeking my managerial skills, my silence. He told me that if the elders found out about the gambling, it would be the end of his ministry, the end of everything. I remember the look in his eyes, that old vulnerability surfacing just long enough to manipulate me. I believed him when he said he would never do it again. I sold the last of my grandmother's jewelry to cover the debt, writing a careful ledger entry that read, "Home repair, emergency plumbing." I covered for him. I became his accomplice, his human shield. That was the true point of no return. My silence didn't save him. It simply taught him that his actions had no consequences. My patience became his license, my forgiveness, his drug. Each small act of covering up the truth, the concealed gambling debts, the fake receipts, the lies to the accountant, it fueled the monster I had helped create. I realized then that my love, the very thing I thought was protecting him, was actually the poison that kept him alive in his sin, my desire for peace, my fear of scandal. It was all just a selfish, elegant way of enabling a man who desperately needed to be stopped. That is the guilt I carry. Not the guilt of the bruises, but the guilt of the complicity, of seeing the fire and handing him the matches. I loaded the warm biscuits onto the serving plate, my hands working smoothly. The scent of yeast and butter filled the air, a warm, deceptive aroma. I heard Thomas's footsteps approaching the kitchen. He was coming to check on the food. He was coming to remind me of his timetable. I smoothed down the apron that hid the ceramic shard and the black ledger. Tonight, the forgiveness stops. Tonight, the complicity ends. He stood in the doorway, filling the space with his presence. He glanced at the plate of perfect biscuits and then back at me, his gaze cold and demanding. He told me to hurry up, that Truong Lao Williams was already waiting. He said, "Don't disappoint me. Sarah, don't ruin this. Not today." I met his eye, the cold calculation in my heart unwavering. I picked up the plate of biscuits, ready to deliver the last piece of the perfect lie. "I am not ruining this day for you, Thomas. I am ending it." I carried the plate of warm biscuits out of the kitchen, the sweetness of the yeast mingling with the cold dread in my throat. I did not hurry. I moved with the slow, deliberate grace that Thomas admired, the grace of a well-oiled machine. As I entered the living room, the air instantly felt heavier, thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the silent weight of expectation. Thomas was still near the fireplace, dominating the conversation, and Truong Lao Williams was seated stiffly in the largest armchair, listening with a critical eye. Thomas paused in his explanation of the new building fund's logistics just long enough for me to set the plate down on the low table. "And here is Sarah's masterpiece," he announced, his voice overflowing with pride. "Our famous buttermilk biscuits. No one in the county can bake like my wife." I offered them my most practiced smile, a small, submissive tilt of the lips that did not involve my eyes. Thomas took one biscuit, breaking it neatly in half, and offered the plate to Williams before taking a bite himself. As I stood back, watching the elder accept the food, my mind was not on the recipe, but on the invisible wounds that had accumulated over the years, the small, daily abrasions that were worse than any single blow. You know, the big events, the cellar, the confession booth, they provide the shock. But it's the tiny cuts that truly bleed you dry. The Bao Han never stopped. It just grew quieter. I remembered 3 years ago, right after I covered his gambling debt. We were at a dinner party just like this one, and I mistakenly called a local donor by the wrong title. He waited until we were alone in the car, pulled over on a dark road, and simply held my wrist. He didn't break it. He didn't even leave a bruise. But the pressure was precise, bone-grinding. He whispered that I was an embarrassment, a small-town girl who would always ruin his image, that silent, calculated cruelty. That was his signature, not the wild rage, but the constant, controlled threat of pain. Thomas was now discussing the church's new budget, emphasizing his fiscal conservatism, his voice resonating with integrity, and the memory was sharp. I recalled the slow, methodical way he took over our financial lives, how he convinced me 5 years ago to sign over control of my small inheritance. For tax purposes, Sarah. For the ministry. He didn't steal it outright. He controlled it until I had to ask permission for every single purchase, a new pair of shoes, a simple trip to the grocery store. It was emotional starvation, calculated to render me utterly dependent. He had stripped me of my autonomy long before he locked me in the cellar, leaving me with only my role as the pastor's wife to define my existence. Williams took a second biscuit, clearly enjoying the perfection of the texture. He smiled and said, "Pastor, you have certainly built a solid fortress here, both spiritual and domestic." Thomas beamed, basking in the elder's approval. I met his eyes across the table, my own gaze steady. I remembered the last time he held my hand outside of a public setting. It was yesterday morning, just hours before the confrontation. He had found a note I wrote reminding myself to check the orphanage fund records. He didn't hit me then. He simply crushed my hand in his for a terrifying minute, a silent promise of the violence to come. He told me that my duty was to God, which meant my duty was to him. The pain was excruciating, a silent scream buried beneath the perfect serenity of our home. I slowly bent down to clear a used saucer from the table, my head close to Thomas's knee. He was still talking to Williams about the blessings of a supportive marriage. I could smell the leather of his shoe, the expensive wool of his trousers. I straightened up and looked at the clock on the wall. The time for serving was almost over. The time for executing the next phase of the plan was starting now. I walked toward the far end of the room, ostensibly to straighten a curtain, but actually heading toward the telephone on the small desk near the window. I had to reach Mike, the police chief, my friend, before the official part of the meeting began. The small china shard in my pocket felt like a cold whisper of encouragement. The silent abuse had ended. Now the silent retribution must begin. I reached the small antique desk near the window, pretending to adjust the heavy velvet drapes. Thomas and Truong Lau Williams were deep in conversation about the budget, their voices a low, steady drone of mutual agreement. I knew I had perhaps 40 seconds of pure focus before Thomas would inevitably look my way. My heart was not pounding. It was cold and heavy, like a smooth river stone. I picked up the ivory rotary phone receiver, the cool plastic familiar in my hand, and quickly dialed the number for the sheriff's station. Not the emergency line, but Mike's direct office extension. It rang twice, and then I heard the familiar, slightly gravelly voice of Sheriff Mike, an old friend from high school, a man known for his unflinching honesty. He answered with the official greeting of the department. I kept my voice low, even, completely devoid of panic. The same measured tone I used when reading scripture in the women's auxiliary meeting. I did not waste time with small talk. I simply stated my purpose using the pre-arranged code we had sometimes joked about years ago, before the darkness settled in. Mike, it's Sarah, Pastor Thomas's wife. I paused just for a beat, listening to the continued drone of Thomas's voice in the background. I'm calling about the security for the elders' meeting today. I know you weren't scheduled to come until much later this week, but there's been a slight adjustment in the itinerary. I didn't say my ribs hurt. I didn't say Thomas hit me. I spoke only in the language of protocol and planning. I told him that due to the sensitive nature of the new building fund discussed with Truong Lau Williams, Thomas felt it would be best for Mike to drop by exactly at noon. Mike's tone shifted immediately. He knew me too well. He knew that any unusual request for security on a Sunday morning was a signal. He asked if everything was all right, a genuine question laced with concern. I gripped the phone tighter, the memory of the cellar pushing me forward. I replied in a voice designed to be both firm and publicly plausible. Yes, everything is fine, Mike. But Thomas insists you arrive precisely at 12 o'clock. He said, and I quote, "Make sure you are properly prepared to bear witness to the outcome of the proceedings." I leaned into those last two words, letting them hang in the air like a silent accusation. Mike paused, understanding passing across the wire. He was a man of the law, but also a man of faith, and the word witness carried weight. I heard the sound of Thomas shifting his weight in the armchair. He was looking my way. I spoke quickly to Mike, adding the final, crucial piece of instruction. Don't ring the doorbell until the clock on the mantel strikes 12. Just wait quietly on the porch, like an angel waiting for the final trumpet. I thanked him formally, hung up the phone with a decisive click, and turned to face Thomas. He was watching me. His eyes narrowed. He asked who I was talking to. I smiled sweetly, the perfect wife's mask firmly in place. The caterer. Darling, just confirming the order for the new tea service. They are bringing a special delivery precisely at noon. He relaxed immediately, accepting the lie because it served his need for perfection. He gestured for me to return to the table, and I obeyed. The line of defense had been breached. The key witness had been summoned. The trap was set. I returned to the living room, the scent of my successful deception still clinging to the receiver in the hallway. Mike was coming. He understood the code. Thomas had sealed the deal by demanding my prompt obedience. I walked past the desk, the heavy silence of the house pressing down. Thomas and Truong Lam Williams were still absorbed in their financial diagrams, the numbers on the papers symbols of authority and trust. Thomas nodded in my direction, satisfied with my return. He told me to begin serving the ham and the grits now, as the main discussion would start in 20 minutes. I went back to the kitchen to gather the heavy, carved silver platter holding the ham, the grits perfectly creamy and steaming in the porcelain bowl. My body moved stiffly, the pain in my ribs a dull companion. I carried the food out, placing the platter centrally on the coffee table, right next to the meticulous financial reports. The contrast was deliberate, the pure, comforting sustenance of the meal placed directly beside the cold, corrupt calculation of the money. I served Williams first, offering him a small, precise portion of ham and a spoonful of the creamy grits. He complimented the aroma, oblivious to the deadly seriousness of the meal. My movement slowed as I reached the edge of the coffee table, the central altar of this false sanctity. I needed a witness that Thomas himself had created, something small and immediate that spoke of destruction. I remembered the piece of china in my apron pocket, the shard of the wedding gift plate that symbolized the shattering of my beautiful lie. I pretended to adjust the small arrangement of flowers Thomas had ordered, and in one swift, silent motion, I pressed the sharp edge of the shard against the pristine linen tablecloth, a slow, deliberate pull. I did not slice a large gash, only a fine, almost invisible tear, a tiny break in the expensive white fabric, a single wound mirroring the silent wound in my marriage. I gently smoothed the cloth back down over the tear, the white linen appearing flawless again. But I knew the tear was there, directly under the serving platter, a hidden flaw, a metaphor made material. I looked at Thomas. He was now speaking passionately about the integrity of his ministry, his voice swelling with false righteousness. I imagined the piece of china returning to my pocket, now tainted with the essence of this staged performance. I was cleansing the house not of dirt, but of truth, so that the final truth would hit harder. You know, every ritual requires a setting of absolute perfection just before the sacrifice. The air must be still. The altar must be clean. The victim must be calm. I walked around the room, making small, unnecessary adjustments, straightening a photo frame, plumping a cushion. I stopped near the window again, looking out at the gravel driveway. The town felt strangely quiet, holding its breath. I imagined Mike sitting out there in his patrol car, waiting for the clock to strike 12, waiting to become the unwilling executioner of the town's beloved pastor. This was my final preparation, a ceremony of cleansing and setting the trap. Everything was in place: the food, the elder, the subtle tear in the fabric of the home. The only thing left was the judgment. I returned to the kitchen doorway, standing perfectly still, my hands clasped neatly in front of me, awaiting the sound of the clock. The quiet in the living room was absolute, broken only by the low, self-assured rumble of Thomas's voice. I stood near the kitchen doorway, perfectly framed, perfectly still. I felt the cold, hard certainty of the black ledger pressed against my skin, the ultimate truth now inches away from its intended audience. Thomas was holding court, explaining his vision for the new children's wing to Truong Lao Williams, ironically using the very funds he had attempted to steal as the centerpiece of his sermon. He glanced at me, his eyes commanding me forward. I walked to the table slowly, picking up the silver coffee pot to offer a refill. As I leaned over Williams, Thomas leaned in, his voice dropping to a near whisper meant only for me. His tone was dismissive, cold. He reminded me that the elders were looking for a seamless transition in leadership, and that my silence on all matters was the greatest gift I could give him today. He said, "Remember your place, Sarah, today. You are simply the backdrop for God's work. Don't spoil the blessing with your clumsy hands." It was his final, arrogant command, his ultimate confirmation of my insignificance. I met his gaze, my own eyes holding a depth of cold resolution that he entirely missed. I poured Williams's coffee without a tremor. The steam rose, momentarily obscuring my face. I placed the pot down, and then, the sound I had been waiting for finally came. The deep, resonant chime of the grandfather clock in the hallway began to strike 12. 1. The sound was stately, unhurried. 2. Thomas paused mid-sentence, annoyed by the interruption. 3. The sound of the bell was immediately followed by a firm, authoritative knock at the front door. Thomas's head snapped toward the sound, his eyebrows furrowing in irritation. He had forgotten my staged call to the caterer. Williams looked up, politely curious. Thomas excused himself with an impatient wave of his hand, clearly intending to deal with the delivery quickly and return to his performance. He walked to the door, adjusting his jacket, ready to accept the false props I had promised. I did not move. I watched the wide entry hall from the living room doorway. I saw Thomas pull open the heavy front door with a smooth, practiced motion, ready with his benevolent pastoral smile. But the smile instantly froze on his face. The color drained from his skin with sickening speed, turning him a pale, sickly gray that matched the winter light outside. He was staring, his eyes wide with profound, paralyzing terror. The man standing on the porch was not a caterer. It was Sheriff Mike, dressed in his full uniform, his expression grim and professional. Mike was not alone. Standing slightly behind him was a uniformed deputy. He carried a small, plain briefcase, not a floral arrangement or a tea service. Thomas stammered, trying to force out a question, trying to retreat. But his legs refused to move. Mike stepped across the threshold, his polished leather boots making a crisp sound on the marble floor. He didn't greet Thomas. He looked directly past him, his eyes locking onto mine in the living room doorway. Mike spoke then, his voice clear and utterly devoid of emotion, cutting through the suffocating quiet. "Pastor Thomas, I am here on official business." He glanced pointedly at Truong Lao Williams, who was now standing up, his own face etched with confusion and rising alarm. "Mrs. Sarah Thomas requested my presence as a witness. I believe we are precisely on time for the proceedings." Thomas spun around, staring at me, his face contorted into an ugly snarl of disbelief and utter humiliation. He realized then that the phone call was not about the caterer. The perfect biscuits were not a peace offering. The smile was not submission. The trap had sprung. Thomas stood frozen in the doorway, a grotesque statue of disbelief. His mouth opened and closed silently, the eloquent voice of the pastor suddenly stolen from him by shock. His eyes finally landed on mine, and they were not filled with rage, but with a pure, naked terror of exposure. He had never feared my pain, only the loss of his reputation. Truong Lao Williams rose slowly from the armchair, his face white and confused. He looked from the perfectly prepared table to the grim faces of the two police officers. Thomas finally found his voice. but it was thin and desperate, stripped of its usual richness. "This is a mistake, Sheriff. This is a misunderstanding. My wife is unwell. She has episodes." "Mike, this is a private matter. She called the caterer, not you." He was reaching for his last mask, the caring husband coping with an unstable wife. He tried to take a protective step toward me, but Mike simply shifted his stance, blocking the doorway to the living room. Sheriff Mike did not even look at Thomas. He addressed Truong Lao Williams directly, his tone professional and heavy with regret. "Truong Lao Williams, I apologize for the interruption of your meeting, but Mrs. Thomas asked me here as a witness concerning the integrity of the church's new building fund." He paused, letting the word integrity land like a hammer blow. "Pastor Thomas, there have been discrepancies in the records regarding a large sum earmarked for the orphanage project. I need a statement regarding the location of the $7,000 immediately." Williams gasped, the sound sharp and painful. He looked at Thomas, betrayal etched on his face. $7,000. Thomas, you said it was a clerical error." Thomas completely ignored him, spinning on his heel to face me, the rage finally overpowering the shame. "You did this, Sarah. You viper. You always hated my success. You want to see me fail." He was screaming now, the veneer completely gone, revealing the ugliness beneath. I stepped away from the doorway and walked slowly toward the center of the living room, towards the table. I moved with deliberate care, every step a public declaration of my freedom. I reached into my apron pocket and pulled out the small, sharp piece of china, the shard of the wedding plate. I held it up, letting the light catch the fractured edges. I didn't aim it at him. I simply looked at it. Thomas recoiled instinctively, expecting violence, but I just looked at the object, then at him. I spoke then, my voice quiet, level, and absolutely final. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need law. I only needed the truth. "I never hated your success, Thomas. I hated the price of it. I sacrificed 20 years of my life to build your voice, to polish your mask. I covered your gambling debt. I endured your cruelty. I accepted the lie because I hoped the good man inside you was still worth the salvation. But when you stole the money from the children, when you kicked me and locked me in the dark for finding the truth," my voice did not break. I realized my love was not salvation. It was a poison that allowed the monster to live. I took the black leather notebook from the waistband of my skirt, holding it out toward Williams. "This is not my confession, Thomas. This is your ledger. Every lie, every missing dollar, every mistress. It is all here. The price of your perfect life." Williams reached out with a trembling hand and accepted the book, his eyes wide as he saw the careful handwriting. He looked at the entries, then up at Thomas, the last thread of respect snapping. Thomas lunged forward, not toward the book, but toward me, a desperate, wild effort to silence me. But Mike was faster. The sheriff intercepted him cleanly, grabbing his arm in a vice-like grip. Thomas struggled, spitting curses at me, but it was too late. The verdict had been delivered by the simple presentation of the truth. The air was sharp with the scent of silver polish and raw hatred. Thomas was struggling against Sheriff Mike's grip, his face distorted by a mixture of impotent rage and profound humiliation. His words were guttural curses directed entirely at me, accusing me of treason and betrayal. Mike held him fast, his own expression one of grim professional sorrow. He looked down at the black ledger Truong Lao Williams held, the weight of the evidence undeniable. Williams, the pillar of the community, finally spoke, his voice trembling with disappointment and disgust. "Thomas, you have betrayed the sacred trust. You have betrayed the children." He let the ledger drop onto the coffee table beside the untouched biscuits. "The ministry will handle this, Sheriff. We will not interfere with the law." Williams looked at me, his expression softening slightly, offering a nod of painful acknowledgement before quickly retreating toward the front door, leaving the execution to the officers. Mike exchanged a silent look with the deputy. The moment had arrived. The deputy stepped forward, the cold steel of the handcuffs catching the light. Thomas lunged again, a final, desperate thrash. "You won't get away with this. Sarah, you hear me. I will be back. You will pay for this public shame. When I get out, I will make you beg." The threat was raw, primal, the last howl of the defeated tyrant. He believed the future still belonged to him. The cuffs clicked shut around his wrists, the sound surprisingly loud in the quiet room, an acoustic punctuation mark ending our life together. As the deputy guided him toward the door, Thomas stopped, twisting to look back at me one last time, his eyes burning with venom. "I never loved you. I owned you." I met his gaze, my face unmoving. I did not flinch from the anger. I did not argue the point. I let his words hang in the air for a deliberate moment. And then I delivered the final verdict. My voice perfectly level, entirely calm. "You didn't own me, Thomas. I simply stayed until your debt to the innocent was due. And now, I am free to forgive the boy I married. But I will never forget the monster you became." Mike led Thomas out, the struggle fading into the distance, the sound of the front door closing, sealing the silence once more. I stood there, the scent of his cologne slowly dissipating. I did not move until I heard the distant wail of the siren, announcing his journey away from the life he destroyed. Then, slowly, I walked to the table. The room was a chaos of broken ceremony, the dropped ledger, the half-eaten biscuits, the empty chair where Williams had sat in judgment. I reached into my apron pocket, pulling out the china shard. I looked at the razor-sharp edge, the perfect weapon I never had to use, and placed it gently on the table. The quiet justice was served by the truth, not by violence. The following days were defined by silence and emptiness. I spent them methodically cleaning the parsonage, not out of obligation, but out of necessity. Every scrub of the floorboards, every piece of linen ironed, every dish put away was an act of personal exorcism. The house no longer felt like a cage. It felt vast, overwhelming. I missed the routine. I missed the predictable rhythm of the servitude, because the vacuum of freedom was terrifying. I often sat by the window, staring at the driveway where Thomas had been taken away, wondering if I had done the right thing, if the cost of my peace was worth the destruction of the community's trust. But the scars on my body, and the memory of the Children's Fund, always gave me the answer. 3 months later, a letter arrived from the state penitentiary. The stationery was thin, cheap, and smelled faintly of institutional disinfectant. I almost threw it away, but something compelled me to open it. It was from Thomas. He didn't ask for bail. He didn't demand revenge. He wrote a single paragraph, short and concise. He wrote that, when he had lost the pulpit, the fame, and the control, he finally realized that he was just a stuttering boy again. He confessed that the cellar had been the closest thing to honesty he had experienced in a decade. He apologized for the hurt. He asked for nothing. He simply said he hoped I had found my peace. I read the letter once, quietly. I felt a pang of genuine sorrow, not for myself, but for the brokenness of the human spirit. I folded the letter neatly and placed it in the back of the black ledger. I did not reply. Forgiveness is a private act, not a conversation. I left the parsonage soon after, leaving the house to the church council. I didn't take the silver. I didn't take the antique furniture. I only took my grandmother's mended jewelry and the chipped ceramic mug. I bought a small cottage in a coastal town where the air smells of salt, not lemon polish. I still bake biscuits, sometimes, and I often look at the sea, vast and endless. I learned that Rangioi is not a wall you build to keep people out. It is the line you draw in the sand to show people who you are. Thomas is gone. The wound is healed, but the scar remains. A quiet reminder of the justice that was served in the silence of a perfect Sunday morning.